Hi, everyone. This is a panel on proof of reserves. Just to get a gauge of the audience sentiment, how many of you are actually familiar with the concept of proof of reserves? Raise your hand.
All right.
Okay, that's more than I expected. That's great. So we're sitting here with three of the real subject matter experts on proof of reserves. To my knowledge, this is actually the first panel at a crypto conference concerning proof of reserves, which is going to be a very important procedure in the coming years in terms of holding exchanges and custodians accountable and making sure they're not running a fractional reserve, that they're not defrauding their users. And you're going to be hearing a lot about it in the coming months. So we have an awesome panel for you today. We're going to introduce the concept to you, explain to you why it matters, and then maybe if we have some time, we'll take some questions. So we're sitting here with Sal Ternullo, formerly of KPMG, now a partner at Warburg Sarris, Sam Abbassi, who formerly of Fidelity, working on custody, now working on a Bitcoin project of his own, and Noah Buxton, digital assets lead at Armanino, which is one of the main audit accounting firms working on this. So gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Let's talk about proof of reserves. Noah, maybe you can start us off. How would you describe what proof of reserves is and the importance of the procedure?
Sure. Proof of reserves is something that's really good for Bitcoin. Proof of reserves is a way to increase trust and transparency in crypto markets generally. And more specifically, proof of reserves is really a way for customers of exchanges and custodians to hold the custodian accountable and be able to know that the liabilities held on platform, or the record of the exchange of how much Bitcoin you have on an exchange or with a custodian, is actually backed up by like-kind assets, right? Bitcoin held by the exchange on your behalf. And there's a big problem there today. We've got a lot of custodians and exchanges that are trying to do the right thing. They're working very hard to serve their customers in the right ways. And then we've got a lot of exchanges that probably aren't doing that. And so I think there's still a big gap between what we all deserve as consumers and Bitcoin holders and what is actually available in the market today.
So Noah, what would a proof of reserve attestation or procedure actually look like in kind of broad general terms?
Yeah, I always like to start with a little sprinkle of history on this because I always like to do justice to the people who first thought about this concept. You know, it's kind of a prior art. And that was Greg Maxwell. In 2014, I think, you know, an early Bitcoin core developer came up with a concept to check the evil exchange, as he called it. And to do that, you could use a cryptographic proof of liabilities, and you could do signatures on the digital asset side. And you could bring these two things together to show that customers' Bitcoin, that liabilities was actually included in this proof of reserves exercise, and that the assets were also there. Again, like kind and in the right amount. So today that's still possible. The truth is that we haven't seen a lot of traction. You know, you probably all don't receive a proof of reserves from the top 3 exchanges that you use frequently, do you? And the question is why? It seems like a great thing. Use a Merkle tree, something that's built into Bitcoin. It's something native to Bitcoin to roll up transactions hashes, and use that to hash liabilities and get a cryptographic proof of all the liability set. Seems brilliant. Digital signatures are cryptographic proof of digital assets. It's the best you can do in terms of testing ownership. So, you know, why not bring those together in a meaningful way? The truth is that these procedures are still all produced by management. They're still all produced by the exchange. And so the liability set that goes in is still subject to cheats, so to speak, right? There's a number of them that we've identified in the paper. Hopefully you'll read the digital chamber paper that we put out. So the procedure today, the way sort of we conceive of it at Armanino, is a little bit different. We basically, as a trusted third party, as an audit firm, we've applied audit methodology, sort of standard reporting, attest standards to this problem. And the recipe for us is really 3 different things. So what does the engagement look like? It's using a Merkle tree to bring those liabilities together, but also validating them as inputs before we Merkleize them. Providing you, the customer, the retail user, the ability to actually use a Merkle verifier on our page, an independent hosted site that allows you to go and check your path to the root were you included in this proof of reserves? And then we actually do digital signatures of the assets, and we put it all together again in a standard attest report, an audit report, so to speak.
And so what does a successful proof of reserve actually prove to the end user of the exchange or custodian? What assurances do they have at that point?
Right. So it doesn't, Bitcoin is fungible. Don't let anybody tell you that it's not. So the Bitcoin that's held in these exchanges, right, is usually commingled in cold wallets and some hot wallets that allow you to actively withdraw from the exchange. But it's commingled, right? So you don't own specific UTXOs. And so the proof of reserves really just shows that your liability was included, right? All of the customers' total Bitcoin holdings on platform are actually backed up by Bitcoin held by the exchange.
So Sal, maybe we'll move to you next. What has been the dynamic between regulators and exchanges on this topic? I mean, are regulators aware that these cryptographic, these native attestations are possible? Are they including them in their toolkit? What's kind of the status quo there?
Yeah, I mean, the dynamic on the regulatory side really has changed over the last 18 to 24 months. I think, generally speaking, accounting standards organizations are probably a bit slower as it relates to adopting the edge of innovation in terms of technical approaches to prove specific tests that Noah was describing. And so, the education curve around realizing the potential of the technology from an auditability perspective is no longer a foreign idea to regulators. In my prior life at KPMG, we did a lot of work in North American markets, both in the US but also in Canada, working with self-regulatory agencies and accounting standards groups and thinking about, the substantive test approaches that audit firms have historically taken to proving liabilities, proving assets, can ultimately be optimized through native cryptographic techniques that are inherent to the technology that we're working with. So as consumers in this space, as Bitcoiners, do you want your exchange to prove to you that your assets actually exist there and that they're actually in control of that exchange or custodian? And so it just comes down to, frankly, raising awareness on the consumer side as it relates to this is technically viable, it should be possible. And that consumer curve has kind of followed the regulatory side. And so, I think probably in the next 12 to 24 months, we'll see emergent standards from the AICPA, the PCAOB, that push forward these approaches and bless them to say that these are acceptable within the context of regulated public organizations. So I think it's an inflection point. The paper that we put out with the Chamber of Digital Commerce provides kind of the blueprint of the current state and the past 8 years of progress in the space. And so I think we're poised for real regulatory change and ultimately progress that benefits all of us at the end of the day.
So historically with proof of reserves, a lot of the early efforts there centered on trying to make it a purely kind of cryptographic procedure that the exchange or custodian could do without relying on an auditor or a third party. However, the paper that we collaborated on, we suggest using effectively a third party. What's the purpose of that? What's the reason that they should be involved in the procedure, basically?
Yeah, I think actually Noah touched on this in kind of his interlude, but it really comes down to the importance of having a third-party agent to verify the signatures and proofs that are produced through the procedure. And so actually demonstrating that, not the organization and the management team themselves are verifying the signatures of messages to show ownership, but some third party who acts as a trust agent in commerce or financial markets providing that function. It's effectively what audit or attestation 2.0 looks like in the context of Bitcoin. So, it's something that I think, frankly, was maybe not part of the early ideation around this concept and procedure, but is instrumental and important to actually realizing this at scale and kind of bringing the institutional adoption around Bitcoin that we've all been working on for the past 10 years.
So maybe we can move to Sam next. Sam has a ton of technical expertise in the custodial setup in proof of reserves themselves. What technically is actually involved in the proof of reserve procedure, both from the demonstrating ownership of asset side and then demonstrating the liability set side.
Yeah, so it's split up into two separate efforts that are usually grouped together when you want to actually prove reserves. So you have the proof of on-chain assets, and then you have the proof of liabilities, which is the exchanges or the custodian's order book or what they have in their back office. The proof of on-chain assets is kind of like the trivial thing. Bitcoin is simply, it's a cryptographic asset, so proving ownership of cryptographic assets is a very trivial thing to do. Maybe breaking that down for people that aren't familiar with this, a Bitcoin transaction is just like a physical check in the sense that it needs a signature that would validate the check, but the check also has to be cashed at the bank for the funds to actually move. In Bitcoin, you can pre-sign transactions, for example, and not actually broadcast it to the network so the funds aren't moving. That would be similar to having a signed check on your desk that never actually gets taken to the bank. So the check itself is valid, but the funds haven't moved. Those private keys are what generate those signatures, and those signatures are what prove that you actually have custody of these assets. So the easiest part of this whole thing is just proving that you actually own the Bitcoin that you're claiming you own as the custodian. The harder part is proving that you have the claim liabilities that your customers own as the exchange. So that's where this Merkle tree, this Merkleized approach is now applied. The things are separate though. Bitcoin is the only source of truth, which is why an auditor is probably good and why an auditor is probably required, because trust is a very finicky thing. All the proof of liabilities part is doing is taking that Merkleized data structure that BitTorrent uses, that Bitcoin uses, that a lot of different systems use, and is applying that specifically to what the exchange is claiming they have in order to make sure that they're not conducting some sort of fractional reserve model.
So as we said before, very few exchanges today actually implement an ongoing proof of reserve procedure. I can probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of exchanges that do it. And none of them, I would say, as of today, really do it in a fully complete way. Some of them do it on a piecemeal basis. So, Sam, I mean, do you ascribe this to technical constraints, to having to reshuffle your custodial setup? Would you say that is, a primary driver of the reticence to implement a procedure like this?
I don't think it's so much technical complexity. I think a lot of maybe the genesis of this paper was frustration, because these things really should be very easy to do. And the paper hopefully outlines the fact that it is quite easy to actually technically implement. This might be better for Noah or Sal, but it seems like it's more of a lack of customer demand, incentives for the exchanges. There isn't really a regulatory framework around having them prove the reserves. So I think it's more of that than it is technical complexity.
So one thing we hear about from exchange CEOs when we ask them to do a proof of reserve is about privacy considerations. So any of you, what are the privacy considerations from the exchange and from the user perspective in POR? Are those prohibitive, and can we work around that?
So I think of the four, or maybe the four custodians that I know of that are outlined in the paper that do have a proof of reserves model is Kraken, CoinFloor, HBTC, and Gate.io, which works with Armanino. So I think CoinFloor has maybe the least amount of privacy preserving features around their proof of reserves, because they're simply actually disclosing all of their individual customer balances. I think an auditor in that sense would probably help, because the auditor is the one that's retaining all of the confidential information and then is allowing customers to selectively verify that their own assets are actually there. There's a little technical feature called a nonce that's usually thrown in there to randomize, or to kind of like the way SALT works in encryption for passwords. That's an added privacy feature, but that is generally a pretty big concern.
Yeah, I would add that if any of the top exchanges that you're working with, they have money transmission licenses, which means that they submit to annual financial statement audits. The procedures within a financial statement audit testing the exchange's balance sheet often require collecting customer lists, testing transactions. So if you're already sort of committed to this way of on-ramping and off-ramping in crypto, you've already exposed your private information to the exchange. The process of doing a proof of reserves is actually, I think, privacy preserving when it comes to that. So the way we've gone about it is to actually receive a hashed user ID from the exchange. So Armanino actually never sees John Doe, the name. We just see a hashed user ID. And from our perspective, that's great. We're not interested in the private or the other confidential information, just the cryptographic proof, just the pieces we need. So I think that's one way to deal with it.
So from a very pragmatic perspective, even if exchanges are attesting to the quality of their reserves, that doesn't prevent a hack, doesn't prevent a theft, doesn't prevent key man risk on the inside. What is the purpose of it in the context of exchanges that may be fraudulent or may be operating in bad faith? Is it still worth doing if there are these exchanges like Quadriga and Gox that are maybe running fractional reserve for long periods of time? How do you guys think about it in that historical context?
I think it just comes down to the trust but verify model of if in any circumstance the impetus, the drive for all of us in the space is really to be independent and to be free of some of the constraints and maybe burdens or risks that have prevailed in central custodial circumstances. And so as we look to service providers to actually provide those functions and features to us, the demand model on the consumer side that Sam spoke to is fundamental to actually driving these types of procedures to be adopted. And I think that plays in and dovetails to kind of some of the regulatory change that I was speaking to before. On a historical basis, I think this could have been a preventative mechanism that helped to create transparency into prior to risk events that ultimately manifested impacting consumers and customer funds. But on a forward basis, as we think about institutionalization, about broader mass adoption, realizing the auditability of the technology itself and the native mechanisms that are embedded to provide that transparency, it's something that we should all be asking for.
So it's interesting because from what I'm hearing from you guys, proof of reserve is relatively trivial to implement. It doesn't necessarily require that many changes to the way the exchanges already operate. There are service providers out in market facilitating proof of reserve. Regulators are starting to look kindly upon the procedure, and it dramatically increases the credibility of the exchange. So despite all that, virtually no exchange does proof of reserve. What do you ascribe this to? Why so much resistance?
Well, I would add one more thing to the benefit of proof of reserves as well, is that using a proof of reserves model doesn't mean you have to have full reserves. You can actually account for a fractional reserve model. Right. The objective there is being upfront with your customers. But again, I think it's back to incentives, back to customers demanding it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the customer demand model and the spectrum of trust that a service provider can create. And I just think from a relative basis, as this space has matured, it just comes down to regulatory dynamics, accounting standards organizations, and consumer demand models. And so, I think on a forward basis, and there definitely are some things in the next couple weeks that will come out of exchanges taking steps forward in this space. But, it really comes down to demand. And so that's something that everyone in this room can participate in. It's something that everybody should be advocating for. And hopefully this gives the base for some of that advocacy.
So some people will probably be wondering about stablecoin attestations. That's kind of the inverse of proof of reserve, where the liabilities are on-chain and the assets are off-chain. How does that dovetail, and would you actually use the term proof of reserve to refer to these, or would you use a broader sort of umbrella term?
I can take that one. So in this working group, we developed a white paper. As part of the initial conversation, we came across this problem, right? There's a lot of different crypto-backed financial instruments that are being issued. And in a way, when you receive an IOU from a centralized exchange just for your spot Bitcoin holdings, that's a sort of a financial instrument, right? That's an IOU from the exchange. Similarly, if you're using a stablecoin, let's say it's Tether on Bitcoin, as Nick said, you've got the asset that's held in a bank account, not visible to you, but you've got the tokenized asset running on chain for everybody to see and auditable. And there's other instruments. We're seeing more exchange-traded products. We're seeing exchange-traded notes come into the marketplace. that are backed by crypto, whether they're cash settled or actual Bitcoin property settled. There's different products, but similarly, it's a financial instrument backed by crypto. And so early on in the process, we thought it made a lot of sense to take this early idea of proof of reserves and be willing to extend it a little bit, right? And I think that was actually kind of tough because being Bitcoin people, caring about the origin of this idea, we did want to do good faith to it. But it's also true that these financial products and new instruments are being issued at a blistering pace. You can barely keep up with all the stuff that's out there. We haven't even mentioned crypto lending, right? Which is yet another great way to earn yield on your Bitcoin without selling it, but a whole new set of problems when it comes to auditability, transparency, and trust. And so we kind of created a model within the paper. Ultimately, it'll be market determined what you all out there think is the right model. But we kind of said that proof of reserves is really an umbrella, right? Can the issuer of an IOU at the exchange, can the issuer of a stablecoin, can the issuer of an exchange-traded product backed by Bitcoin, can they prove to the customer that they're properly reserving the assets? And so we kind of broke it into those three categories. Stablecoin issuers or tokenized commodities could fall into that as well. Proof of reserves for platforms like exchanges, custodians, and crypto lenders. And then a third bucket of things, again, exchange-traded products, unique financial instruments backed by Bitcoin. And so that's, each of those we've given sort of a sub-name, but we think of this overall as proof of reserves as the general concept.
So just to zoom out a little bit, I mean, if you consider Bitcoin's physical analog gold, it's virtually impossible to verify a bar gold. You have to actually, typically for a good delivery bar, you really have to melt it down and perform an assay in order to chemically verify that the gold doesn't have tungsten fillers in it, for instance. Proof of reserve is the equivalent of verifying a third party's gold in the vault in a truly trust minimized way. So when you think about moving to a Bitcoin standard, a Bitcoin-based financial system, how does that compare? I mean, what additional assurances, what additional qualities do you get from that proof of reserve enhanced system relative to the old trust maximized custodial model?
And maybe I'll take that one. I mean, I started my career in audit. I joined KPMG and built a business there focused on audit. And the entire time was looking to disrupt audit as it relates to realizing the potential of the tech to do that. The idea that audits are performed on an annual basis, that substantive testing over balance sheet assets is performed on a periodic, one time per year frequency, doesn't suit the nature of a truly borderless global asset like Bitcoin. And so we should, again, as the space continues to move forward and institutions continue to drive adoption, the demand model and rigor around auditability and control and proof is increasing. And so, the two-pronged demand model that we're shaping here on the consumer side, but also institutions as well, and it's just going to be a foundational piece of how we look at the future of a Bitcoin standard.
Well, I think we're pretty much at time here. We have written a paper on proof of reserves with the Chamber of Digital Commerce. We're going to continue to advocate for it. I encourage you to all do the same. Exchanges will only adopt this if you, the users of those exchanges, ask for it. There are some very favorable moves happening, but we have to continue to apply pressure to these exchanges. Otherwise, we will run the risk of exchanges operating on a fractional reserve, and that just doesn't comport with the nature of the asset class. So I want to thank our three panelists, genuine subject matter experts on this. Thanks so much for coming on today. Really fantastic.
Thanks, Nick.